Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 22 August 2025. It is the 151st anniversary of the birth of Max Scheler, who was born in Munich on this date in 1874. Last year, I focused on Scheler's essay, Man and History, which was in his collection of essays that translated into English as Philosophical Perspective. And this essay, Man and History, is Scheler's most explicit engagement with philosophy of history. The last book that Scheler published was a short work on philosophical anthropology. When I was still rather young, I found a copy of the Hans Meyerhoff translation of Man's Place in Nature at a used bookstore. I got it and I read it through. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I can read it and understand it, but that took some time. The book was translated again by Manfred Frings, who is one of the great Scheler scholars of our time and who has edited Scheler's collected works. And he translated the book as The Human Place in the Cosmos. I'm going to refer to this by Meyerhoff's title, Man's Place in Nature, but translating it as Man's Place in the Cosmos would be a more literal rendering than either the Meyerhoff or the Frings translation. The thread of philosophical anthropology that runs through Scheler's conception of history in his essay, Man and History, as well as in his other works, reaches what is perhaps its culmination in his last book, Man's Place in Nature. In this sense, it's also the culmination of his life's work, as Scheler was always centrally concerned with philosophical anthropology. So, what is philosophical anthropology? At its simplest, it is the question, what is man, asked and answered as a philosophical question. We can also ask the question as a question of natural science, and physical anthropology and cultural anthropology will give us somewhat different answers to this, and both will be different from a philosophical answer to the question. The Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy says that philosophical anthropology is, quote, philosophical inquiry concerning human nature, often starting with the question of what generally characterizes human beings in contrast to other kinds of creatures and things, unquote. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy, another one of my go-to philosophical references, says that, quote, philosophical anthropology came into its own only in the wake of German idealism. For anthropos, man, contrasts in this context not only with God, but also with soul, mind, spirit, thought, consciousness, words denoting the mental or transcendental and intellectual aspect of man that the idealists tended to stress. Anthropology is to study not some favored aspect of man, but man as such, man as a whole being, biological, acting, thinking, etc. being, unquote. I often turn to Mario Bunge's Dictionary of Philosophy to get a curmudgeon's view of things, but he plays it pretty straight with philosophical anthropology, which he defines as, quote, the branch of ontology that deals with human beings in general, rather than with any particular human group. Because of its a priorism, it has been in decline since the birth of scientific anthropology at the end of the 19th century, unquote. Bunge wrote this in 1999, saying that philosophical anthropology had been in decline since the 19th century. But the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy says that, quote, the enterprise of a philosophical anthropology remains a viable and potentially significant one, unquote. I guess it's possible that a discipline could be at the same time in decline for more than a century and be viable and potentially significant, though that may seem paradoxical. So there's a surprising degree of agreement among these sources, and both the Oxford and Cambridge articles identify Scheler as one of the central figures in philosophical anthropology. There are many books that we could call philosophical anthropology, but which we don't usually label in this way. For example, Jacob Bronowski's The Identity of Man could be called an essay or a series of lectures in philosophical anthropology. There could just as well be a philosophical anthropology in analytical philosophy as there is in the continental philosophy of Scheler and Plessner, but analytical philosophers usually aren't interested in these questions with certain important exceptions. Scheler's philosophical anthropology was explicitly formulated in opposition both to naturalism and to traditional idealism. Last year, I emphasized Scheler's anti-naturalism, which I compared to Husserl's anti-naturalism. Scheler's anti-naturalism isn't a rejection of the natural world, but the claim that there's something over and above the natural world that distinguishes human beings. That may sound pretty familiar, but Scheler develops this in his own distinctive way. For example, he explicitly rejects emergentism, something that I've talked about in several episodes, but he still recognizes different levels of life. In Man's Place in Nature, he identifies 4 levels of life, and each level of life is characterized both by a psychic component and a physical component, which in the Fring's translation he calls the biopsychic structure of the world, and Meyerhoff renders as the stages of psychophysical life. So he thinks there is a psychic dimension to all life. We could vulgarly say that in Scheler, mind goes all the way down, so presumably microbes have their own faint psychic life of their own. At this lowest level of life, the psychic dimension is purely an impulsion, quote, devoid of consciousness, sensation, and representation, unquote. The second level or stage of life is instinctual life. The third is associative behavior and memory, while the fourth is practical intelligence, which includes problem solving. It's important to note that Scheler isn't using these levels of life to distinguish human beings from other life on Earth, as, for example, Aristotle did when he distinguished the nutritive soul that plants have, the sensible soul that animals have, and the rational soul that only human beings possess. So here again, we have a layering of kinds of being, but it's not the same as Scheler's layering of kinds of being, or I should say psychophysical kinds of being, and it doesn't serve the same purpose. It's not used to distinguish human beings. Again, for Scheler, all species in the terrestrial biosphere have a psychic dimension, and other species other than human beings have practical intelligence or problem-solving abilities. To distinguish human beings from these 4 levels or stages of life, Scheler calls upon his non-naturalism, since he posits what he calls spirit, Geist in German, which only human beings possess. So human beings, in addition to possessing the 4th level or stage of psychophysical life, which is also possessed by other species in the biosphere, also possesses spirit, and this spirit is the differentia between human beings and everything else. The essence of spirit, according to Scheler, is freedom. So far, this sounds a lot like Hegel, but Scheler takes it in a different direction than Hegel's idea of the objective spirit participating in the historical process and leading on to always greater forms of freedom. Scheler emphasizes that the freedom human beings have as a result of spirit liberates human beings both from the physical and the psychical constraints that characterize the rest of nature. So spirit isn't just a cherry on top of a psychophysical being. In some ways, is a negation of both the psychic and the physical. I find this very interesting, as Scheler uses his philosophical anthropology to argue a distinctive position that I haven't found elsewhere. Quote, at the very same moment when the human in becoming broke all routines to get adjusted to animal life that had arisen before him, to the environment and the environment to him, and exactly the same moment when his human being placed himself outside nature to make it an object to be dominated as an object of novel principles and signs, at exactly the same moment, he had to anchor his very own center of being somehow outside and away from the cosmos. He could not anymore conceive of himself simply as a part or as a simple member in the world, having placed himself so bravely above it, unquote. This gives a sense in which Scheler thought that human spirit not only differentiated man from the rest of nature, but also in a sense negated what came before him, negated his inherited psychical and physical life. Not only is this non-natural, it's also paradoxical. But even as it's paradoxical, it describes something essential about the human condition, which is the human being's ability to raise himself up out of the world and to see himself in contrast to, if not also in opposition to, the world. A little further along, Scheler furthers this non-naturalistic conception of the relationship to the world and writes, quote, "The place of this self-realization, or let us say, the place of self-deification, which being through itself is seeking, and for which the becoming of being through itself had to pay the price of history, this place is precisely the human being, the human self, and the human heart," unquote. With this, Scheler is putting himself way out on a limb, and he knows it. On the next page, he writes, quote, "One might well tell me at this point, and indeed I was once told, that it is impossible to bear the idea of an unfinished and God in becoming. My answer is that metaphysics is not an insurance company for weak people in need of protection," unquote. He knows he's being highly unorthodox in proposing the self-deification of humanity, which is a God in becoming, as he says, but he's unapologetic about it. And this isn't surprising given that Scheler's religious interests are pervasive throughout his writings, but also unorthodox. We can compare this, for example, to Joseph Pieper or Jacques Marichal, both of whom were 20th century philosophers of history who are also largely religiously orthodox. Returning to the previous quote, Scheler said that history is the price that we pay for self-realization that culminates in self-deification. And this is, I think, a fascinating take on history that could be developed on its own. Again, this is not unlike Hegel, who said that nothing has been accomplished without passion and that history is a slaughter bench. But I think if Scheler had lived to elaborate this take on history in his last book, he would have taken it in a different and non-Hegelian direction. As it stands, it's only a fragment that I pulled out of a sentence, and there's not enough context to fully develop it, but someone with a better feel for Scheler's thought than I have could probably give a good account of what's implicit in the idea that history is the price we pay for self-realization. That there is a price to pay implies a sacrifice made, and perhaps even a painful sacrifice. But there's also a self-realization that's won through the sacrifice, which self-realization is for Scheler self-deification, and this is presumably worth any price paid. Scheler's longest books are on ethics, his Formalism and Ethics and a Non-Formal Ethics of Values, and Philosophy of Religion on the Eternal in Man. And it's not difficult to see that ethics and religion are an integral part of philosophical anthropology. An individual's moral and religious orientation is likely to play a disproportionately large role in what that individual believes himself and humanity to be. These are fundamental orientations within the world, or, as Scheler would have it, outside the world, where we place ourselves as human beings over and against nature. A philosophical anthropology can be understood as one category, the human category, of an ontological taxonomy in which we have a place for everything and everything is understood in its proper place. We have other ontological categories for other kinds of being, but the human category stands outside the categories of nature, and in this sense, it stands alone. I often say that human beings are biological beings, and this could be said to be in the spirit of philosophical anthropology, since that's my way of accounting for the place of human beings within the world. But recall that for Scheler, human beings have a place outside the world. Here's another quote from Scheler to drive the point home. Quote, "When the human being placed himself outside the entire cosmos, that act belongs to his essence. It is the act of becoming man himself. And when the cosmos became an object of his comprehension, he had to turn and to see around himself while shuddering, as it were, and ask himself, where am I? What is my place? Having become human, he could not really say anymore, I am a part of the world and enclosed by it. For the act being of his spirit and person is superior even to the forms of the being of the world in space and time. Unquote. Whether our place is snugly within the terrestrial biosphere, as I see it, or set apart from it, as Scheler argues, we want to know where we fit in the big picture, even if it means, as Scheler says, that we shudder when we ask the question, where am I and what is my place? We want to know who we are, because knowing who we are helps us to negotiate the labyrinth that is life. Minimally, because it can strengthen the individual's sense of self, giving one the intestinal fortitude to carry on through difficult circumstances. Potentially, however, knowing our place in the world gives us much more than strength and courage. It also gives us knowledge of what we can do and what we can be. This is the question that philosophical anthropology seeks to answer. This desire to know who and what we are is, of course, a perennial question. E.O. Wilson's book, The Social Conquest of Earth, which I mentioned in the previous episode on subsurface ocean worlds, uses Paul Gauguin's painting, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? As a motif to launch his argument, discussing the painting in the prologue to his book, much as Foucault started his The Order of Things with a detailed discussion of the Diego Velázquez painting Las Meninas. Wilson began chapter 1 of his book thus, quote, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Conceived in ultimate simplicity by Paul Gauguin on the canvas of his Tahitian masterpiece, these are in fact the central problems of religion and philosophy. Will we ever be able to solve them? Sometimes it seems not, yet perhaps we can, unquote. Some years ago, I wrote an essay taking the title of Gauguin's painting as my title and talking about each of these questions in turn. In that essay, I said that where we are now is a function of what we are, and what we are is a function of our history. History is one dimension of philosophical anthropology. It's the dimension that tells us where we are in time. The other dimensions, as I suggested, are a function of our history, but they aren't identical to history. And we need a discipline like philosophical anthropology to bring out these differences and to help us to understand not only where we are in time and space, but where we are in relation to the big picture. Knowing where we are could be called our existential positionality. And our position in space and time gives us the minimal physical parameters of our existential positionality. Arguably, metaphysics, ethics, religion, and mythology give us our existential positionality relative to other parameters, which we intuitively understand as knowing our place in the big picture of things. Are we important or are we irrelevant? Should we be proud or should we be humble? In some ways, we take our moral cues from our existential positionality, so the metaphysical or the mythological dimension may be more fundamental even than the moral dimension. I think of the effort of philosophical anthropology to give us our existential positionality as a kind of metaphysical orienteering, in which we find ourselves scouting a landscape we scarcely know in the attempt to gather enough clues to piece together where we are and where we belong. So happy birthday, Max Scheler, and thanks for listening.